Hi students, welcome to HSC Earth and Environmental Science and Module 8 Resource Management. This is video number 20 and we're into the last few now as we conclude our study of resource management. In this one, we'll look at cultural traditions that preserve country and place. A couple of interesting learning intentions or learning areas, outcomes that you need to cover in this last final section of work. This one's about investigating the processes used by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as sustainable resource managers. For example, cultural traditions that preserve country and place and the resources located in those spaces. One thing which I should say is that there are some images in this video and in the PowerPoint that was used to create this video that may be sensitive to some people who would be watching this video. So I just put that warning out ahead of time. So in the Port Stephens area, we're on Worimi land. And so I'm going to focus some of my discussion in this video and the last couple of videos on the Worimi people particularly, because that's the area that we're in, and I think that's important for us to understand. But this is obviously something that's going to be very different depending on what part of the country that you are watching this particular video. So it's very important that you try and link into the local Aboriginal community, understand the land that you're on and the relationship that people have to country. Maybe a few general comments first, and then as we work through this, we'll look at some specifics relating to the Worimi people. So recent research has suggested that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been in the Australian region for getting around upwards to around 70,000 years. These figures continue to change as we find more artifacts and as we continue to date those artifacts, understand how long the people have been occupying the Australian continent. Our figure of around 70,000 is based on dating techniques used primarily with paintings discovered in the northern Kimberley region of Western Australia. As such, these people have survived in a land where climate has varied dramatically over that time frame. Their period of occupation also tends to overlap, or at least appears to overlap, with some of the megafauna that we find fossil remains of as well. Having lived in the region for such a long period of time, it makes sense that these people developed a range of different strategies to manage the landscape sustainably. Certainly, the changes that have occurred in the last 200 plus years of European settlement seem to be significantly different to what has been changed over the previous 70,000 years. Indigenous people have long held cultural and traditional responsibilities to protect and manage their land and sea country. They own an estimated 20% of the Australian continent, upon which lies some of our most environmentally precious natural assets, and for Indigenous people is rich in cultural and spiritual meaning. What we do know is that the Worimi people lived a hunter and gatherer life. The men hunted large animals like kangaroos and emus, whilst women and children hunted smaller animals and collected fruits, berries and medicinal plants. The local environment provided a range of different types of food sources which changed depending on the seasons. Although there are no major freshwater creeks or rivers in the area, this would not have constituted a barrier to occupation, as groundwater was readily available in low-lying areas. And we've had so much rain, so much flooding in recent months, certainly through the course of 2022, that you would be very aware, if you've done any travel at all, where some of those low-lying areas are and just how much water can actually collect in those regions. Estuarine, marine and terrestrial plants and animal resources are extensive and easily accessible. The traditional knowledge of the Worimi people of the plants and animals in this area is extensive and really has not been surpassed. The area of Port Stephens has a large area of coast and is almost like a peninsula on this region of the coast, but it also has regions inland as well. So there are varying strategies, land management strategies that we can see from the Worimi for managing these complex and quite different types of land. On the coast in the harbour, the Worimi caught fish and collected many types of shellfish, including pippies, mussels and oysters. To maintain the fragile environment and because of seasonal variations, Worimi would only stay in an area for a certain time. This kind of nomadic lifestyle is one of the key points around sustainability, because it means that you're not constantly drawing from the resources of the same part of the country. You're sharing, around the different types of resources that you need, the different foods you're going to eat, the different materials that you're going to use to live, either for shelter, for weapons, and that's going to continue to avoid depleting a particular area by moving around. It also helps ensure that the Worimi didn't hunt, fish, or harvest the same area too much, and that meant there was time for material to be replenished. Remember, when we talked about one of our definitions of sustainability, we wanted to ensure that any resource that we were taking for some purpose, particularly for food, had time to recover, had time to replenish those numbers that we'd taken away. So a very, very important part of resource management. Every part of the animal and plant was eaten or used to make things such as clothing, baskets, tools, and weapons, and so there was very little waste. Occasionally we do find middens, which are areas which I guess Europeans like myself might consider to be waste dumps, but were part of very complex cooking processes, and also very important culturally. One way in which we can see visual expression of the link between the people and country is through the use of totems. There's a really great book of artworks by Melissa Lilly that has included in it a number of different totems representative of the relationship between the Worimi and the lands and the waters around which they live. Wibere is the black dolphin and is part of the sea country and totemic species, which is very important to Worimi people. Because Wibere is found in every part of Worimi Sea country, all clans and communities had interactions and connections with this animal. They admired it for its sea country navigation and hunting abilities, and also for the way that it taught and nurtured its own young. Its high levels of intelligence enabled it to have a great knowledge of fish movement and had the ability to adapt and efficiently hunt in changing sea country environments. The Worimi people had a very close connection and association with the black dolphin, with Wibere, and have been known to hit the water with their hands or stomp their feet or push their spears into the sand to call in the dolphins. The dolphins would respond by herding schools of fish into the shallow waters and then drive them onto the dry sand. The Worimi people would then collect the stranded fish from the shoreline for their personal use, while the dolphins would teach their young to hunt and eat the rest of the catch. This was really a fantastic example of symbiosis, a mutual relationship between two different species, in this case humans and dolphins, in order to hunt together and to share the catch together, a relationship that built between these two different groups of living things. And it's another really nice example of the way in which the Worimi people interacted and managed the natural resources that they have available to them. It's true that the Aboriginal people created a complex system of land management. No pristine wildernesses, but rather a patchwork of burnt and regrown areas. Fire was an incredible ally to the Aboriginal people. In using fire, Aboriginal people could plan and predict plant growth and with it attract animals for hunting. They converted the land to grassland for the maintenance of animals, plants, and fresh drinking water. Aboriginal people not only thought of kangaroos when laying out their burn patterns, but also possums, wombats, birds, insects, reptiles, and the plants themselves. Burn patterns needed to consider these plant life cycles. When we look at some of the research, and there are a number of areas of contradictory research, and it really is worth having a deep look at this, and all I can provide is a very brief overview. There's lots and lots more information, and of course the majority of the information that you're going to get from the local people is through through conversation, through yarns, through chatting. The oral traditions are still very strong, and that's the way that we continue to learn. Some of what seems to be the case is that those fires that were regularly lit were not uncontrolled. Uncontrolled fire would wipe out food resources, and we're still close enough to some of the big bushfires to know exactly what happens when fire burns out of control. So the Aboriginal people couldn't afford to do that. They didn't have helicopters to drop water on places. They didn't have hoses. if they didn't control the fires, there was every chance that they would suffer and or die. Evidence strongly suggests that no devastating fires occurred, and so therefore the use of fire was a controlled use. We also suspect that the Aboriginal people were farmers. Researchers have found that Aboriginal people grew crops of tubers such as yams, grains like native millet, macadamia nuts, fruits and berries that were not only gathered but actively fostered. People were able to domesticate animals, rear dingoes, possums, emus, cassowaries, even moved caterpillars to new breeding areas and carried fish stocks across country. They were involved in different types of aquaculture too, the construction of dams. There's strong evidence that suggests that sophisticated farming, agriculture and aquaculture practices occurred across much of the country, not just in the local Worimi land. Early explorers watched women harvesting yams, onions, cultivating the land and creating reserves of flour and grain. Aboriginal people also developed customised templates that suited the land, the plants and the animals that grew in the areas around them. They knew which animals preferred what foods. For example, kangaroos prefer the short grass, native bees prefer desert bloodwoods, and so on. Managing the land with fire required the people to consider the dependencies of these animals on their specific dietary requirements. As a result, we see a lot of exceptional, sustainable land management practices when we look at the Indigenous occupation of this country and how they've interacted. And I guess one of the things that it does is it helps us to understand their deep connection to country. We're going to continue to explore this in the next video. Thanks for watching.